Hello, dear friends and students. This is the History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra. Chapter number 9, Administrative Changes after 1858. The revolt of 1857 gave a severe jolt to the British administration in India and made its reorganization inevitable. In fact, Indian society, the Indian government, and the Indian economy all underwent significant changes in the decades following the revolt. Administration. An Act of Parliament in 1858 transferred the power to govern from the East India Company to the British Crown. While authority over India had previously been wielded by the directors of the company and the Board of Control, now this power was to be exercised by a Secretary of State for India, aided by a council. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet, and as such was responsible to Parliament. Thus, the ultimate power over India remained with Parliament. The Council of the Secretary of State, known as the India Council, was to advise the Secretary of State, who could overrule its decisions. In financial matters, however, the approval of the Council was essential. By 1869, the Council was completely subordinated to the Secretary of State. Most of the members of the India Council were retired British Indian officials. Under the Act, government was to be carried on as before by the Governor-General, who was also given the title of Viceroy or Crown's personal representative. He was paid 2.5 lakhs of rupees a year in addition to his many allowances. With the passage of time, the Viceroy was increasingly reduced to a subordinate status in relation to the British government in matters of policy as well as execution of policy. This tendency was, of course, nothing new. Already, as a result of the Regulating Act, Pitt's India Act, and the later Charter Acts, the Government of India was being effectively controlled from London. Though India had been conquered by the East India Company for its own benefit, it had gradually come to be ruled in the interests of the dominating sections of British society. The India Act of 1858 further strengthened this tendency. But, in the past, a great deal of decision-making power was in practice left in the hands of the Governor-General. Instructions from London took a few weeks to arrive, and the Government of India had often to take important policy decisions in a hurry. Control by the authorities in London was therefore often more in the nature of post facto evaluation and criticism than of actual direction. In other words, the London authorities superintended the administration of India but did not run it. But by 1870, a submarine cable had been laid through the Red Sea between England and India. Orders from London could now reach India in a matter of hours. The Secretary of State could now control the minutest details of administration and do so constantly, every hour of the day. Thus, the authority that exercised final and detailed control and direction over Indian affairs came to reside in London, thousands of miles distant from India. No Indian had a voice in the India Council or the British Cabinet or Parliament. Indians could hardly even approach such distant masters. Under such conditions, Indian opinion had even less impact on government policy than before. On the other hand, British industrialists, merchants, and bankers increased their influence over the government of India. This made the Indian administration even more reactionary than it was before 1858. For now, even the pretense of liberalism was gradually given up. In India, the Act of 1858 provided that the Governor-General would have an executive council whose members were to act as heads of different departments and as his official advisors. The position of the members of the council was similar to that of cabinet ministers. Originally, there were 5 members of this council, but by 1918, there were 6 ordinary members, apart from the commander-in-chief, who headed the army department. The council discussed all important matters and decided them by a majority vote. But the Governor-General had the power to override any important decision of the council. In fact, gradually, all power was concentrated in the Governor-General's hands. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 enlarged the Governor-General's Council for the purpose of making laws, in which capacity it was known as the Imperial Legislative Council. The Governor-General was authorized to add to his Executive Council between 6 and 12, members of whom at least half had to be non-officials, who could be Indian or English. The Imperial Legislative Council possessed no real powers and should not be seen as a sort of elementary or weak parliament. It was merely an advisory body. It could not discuss any important measure, and no financial measures at all without the previous approval of the government. It had no control over the budget. It could not discuss the actions of the administration. The members could not even ask questions about them. In other words, the Legislative Council had no control over the executive. Moreover, no bill passed by it could become an act till it was approved by the Governor-General. On top of all this, the Secretary of State could disallow any of its acts. Thus, the only important function of the Legislative Council was to endorse official measures and give them the appearance of having been passed by a legislative body. In theory, the non-official Indian members were added to the council to represent Indian views. Since it was believed by many British officials and statesmen that the revolt of 1857 would not have occurred if Indian views had been known to the rulers. But the Indian members of the Legislative Council were few in number and were not elected by the Indian people, but were nominated by the Governor-General, whose choice invariably fell on princes and their ministers, big zamindars, big merchants, or retired senior government officials. They were thoroughly unrepresentative of the Indian people or of the growing nationalist opinion. Once again, Indians had no hand in the processes of government. The government of India remained, as before 1858, an alien despotism. This was, moreover, no accident, but a conscious policy. Charles Wood, the Secretary of State for India, while moving the Indian Council's Bill of 1861, said, "All experience teaches us that where a dominant race rules another, the mildest form of government is a despotism." Provincial administration. The British had divided India for administrative convenience into provinces, 3 of which, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, were known as presidencies. The presidencies were administered by a governor and his executive council of 3, who were appointed by the Crown. The presidency governments possessed more rights and powers than other provinces, which were administered by lieutenant governors and chief commissioners appointed by the Governor-General. The provincial governments enjoyed a great deal of autonomy before 1833, when their power to pass laws was taken away and their expenditure subjected to strict central control. But experience soon showed that a vast country like India could not be efficiently administered on the principle of strict centralization. The Act of 1861 marked the turning of the tide of centralization. It laid down that legislative councils, similar to that of the centre, should be established first in Bombay, Madras, and Bengal, and then in other provinces. The provincial legislative councils, too, were mere advisory bodies, consisting of officials and 4 to 8 non-official Indians and Englishmen. They too lacked the powers of a democratic parliament. The evil of extreme centralization was most obvious in the field of finance. The revenues from all over the country and from different sources were gathered at the center and then distributed by it to the provincial governments. The central government exercised strict control over the smallest details of provincial expenditure. But this system proved quite wasteful in practice. It was not possible for the central government to supervise the efficient collection of revenues by a provincial government or to keep adequate check over its expenditure. On the one hand, the two governments constantly quarreled over minute details of administration and expenditure. And, on the other, a provincial government had no motive to be economical. The authorities therefore decided to decentralize public finance. The first step in the direction of separating central and provincial finances was taken in 1870 by Lord Mayo. The provincial governments were granted fixed sums out of central revenues for the administration of certain services like police, jails, education, medical services, and roads, and were asked to administer them as they wished. They could increase or reduce allotments to any of these departments within the limits of the total funds given to them. Lord Mayo's scheme was enlarged in 1877 by Lord Lytton, who transferred to the provinces certain other heads of expenditure like land revenue, excise, general administration, and law and justice. To meet the additional expenditure, a provincial government was to get a fixed share of the income realized from that province, from certain sources like stamps, excise taxes, and income tax. Further changes in these arrangements were made in 1882 during the Viceroyalty of Lord Ripon. The system of giving fixed grants to the provinces was ended, and instead, a province was to get the entire income within it from certain sources of revenue and a fixed share of the income from other sources. Thus, all sources of revenue were now divided into three: general, provincial, and those to be divided between the center and the provinces. The financial arrangements between the center and the provinces were to be reviewed every 5 years. The different measures of financial decentralization discussed above did not really mean the beginning of genuine provincial autonomy or of Indian participation in provincial administration. They were much more in the nature of administrative reorganization, whose chief aims were to keep down expenditure and increase income. In theory, as well as in practice, the central government remained supreme and continued to exercise effective and detailed control over the provincial governments. This was inevitable, for both the central government and the provincial governments were completely subordinated to the Secretary of State and the British government. Local bodies. Financial difficulties led the government to further decentralize administration by promoting local government through municipalities and district boards. The Industrial Revolution gradually transformed European economy and society in the 19th century. India's increasing contact with Europe and new modes of imperialism and economic exploitation made it necessary that some of the European advances in economy, sanitation, and education should be transplanted in India. Moreover, the rising Indian nationalist movement demanded the introduction of modern improvements in civic life. Thus, the need for the education of the masses, sanitation, water supply, better roads, and other civic amenities was increasingly felt. The government could no longer afford to ignore it, but its finances were already in disorder due to heavy expenditure on the army and the railways. It could not increase its income through new taxes as the burden of the existing taxation was already very heavy on the poor, and further addition to it was likely to create discontent against the government. On the other hand, the government did not want to tax the upper classes. But the authorities felt that the people would not mind paying new taxes if they knew that their proceeds would be spent on their own welfare. It was therefore decided to transfer local services like education, health, sanitation, and water supply to local bodies who would finance them through local taxes. Many Englishmen had pressed for the formation of local bodies on another ground also. They believed that associating Indians with the administration in some capacity or the other would prevent their becoming politically disaffected. This association could take place at the level of local bodies without in any way endangering British monopoly of power in India. Local bodies were first formed between 1864 and 1868, but almost in every case they consisted of nominated members and were presided over by district magistrates. They did not, therefore, represent local self-government at all, nor did the intelligent Indians accept them as such. They looked upon them as instruments for the extraction of additional taxes from the people. A step forward, though a very hesitant and inadequate one, was taken in 1882 by Lord Ripon's government. A government resolution laid down the policy of administering local affairs largely through rural and urban local bodies, a majority of whose members would be non-officials. These non-official members would be elected by the people wherever and whenever officials felt that it was possible to introduce elections. The resolution also permitted the election of a non-official as chairman of a local body. Provincial acts were passed to implement this resolution, but the elected members were in a minority in all the district boards and in many of the municipalities. They were, moreover, elected by a small number of voters, since the right to vote was severely restricted. District officials continued to act as presidents of district boards, though non-officials gradually became chairmen of municipal committees. The government also retained the right to exercise strict control over the activities of the local bodies and to suspend and supersede them at its own discretion. The result was that except in the presidency cities of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, the local bodies functioned just like departments of the government and were in no way good examples of local self-government. All the same, the politically conscious Indians welcomed Ripon's resolution, and worked actively in these local bodies, with the hope that in time they could be transformed into effective organs of local self-government. Changes in the army. The Indian Army was carefully reorganized after 1858. Some changes were made necessary by the transfer of power to the Crown. Thus, the East India Company's European forces were merged with the Crown troops. But the army was reorganized most of all to prevent the recurrence of another revolt. The rulers had seen that their bayonets were the only secure foundation of their rule. Several steps were taken to minimize, if not completely eliminate, the capacity of Indian soldiers to revolt. Firstly, the domination of the army by its European branch was carefully guaranteed. The proportion of Europeans to Indians in the army was raised and fixed at 1 to 2 in the Bengal army and 2 to 5 in the Madras and Bombay armies. Moreover, the European troops were kept in key geographical and military positions. The crucial branches of the army, like artillery, and later in the 20th century, tanks and armored corps, were put exclusively in European hands. The older policy of excluding Indians from the officer corps was strictly maintained. Till 1914, no Indian could rise higher than the rank of a subedar. Secondly, the organization of the Indian section of the army was based on the policy of balance and counterpoise, or divide and rule, so as to prevent its chances of uniting again in an anti-British uprising. Discrimination on the basis of caste, region, and religion was practiced in recruitment to the army. A fiction was created that Indians consisted of martial and non-martial classes. Soldiers from Awadh, Bihar, Central India, and South India, who had first helped the British conquer India, but had later taken part in the revolt of 1857, were declared to be non-martial. They were no longer taken into the army on a large scale. On the other hand, the Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pathans, who had assisted in the suppression of the revolt, were declared to be martial and were recruited in large numbers. In addition, Indian regiments were made a mixture of various castes and groups, which were so placed as to balance each other. Communal, caste, tribal, and regional loyalties were encouraged among the soldiers so that the sentiment of nationalism would not grow among them. For example, caste and communal companies were introduced in most regiments. Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, wrote to the Viceroy Canning in 1861, "I never wish to see again a great army, very much the same in its feelings and prejudices and connections, confident in its strength, and so disposed to rise in rebellion together. If one regiment mutinies, I should like to have the next regiment so alien that it would be ready to fire into it." Thus, the Indian Army remained a purely mercenary force. Moreover, every effort was made to keep it separated from the life and thoughts of the rest of the population. It was isolated from nationalist ideas by every possible means. Newspapers, journals, and nationalist publications were prevented from reaching the soldiers. But, as we shall see later, all such efforts failed in the long run, and sections of the Indian Army played an important role in our struggle for freedom. The Indian Army became in time a very costly military machine. In 1904, it absorbed nearly 52% of the Indian revenues. This was because it served more than one purpose. India, being the most prized colonial possession of the time, had to be constantly defended from the competing imperialisms of Russia, France, and Germany. This led to a big increase in the size of the Indian Army. Secondly, the Indian troops were not maintained for India's defense alone. They were also often employed to extend or consolidate British power and possessions in Asia and Africa. Lastly, the British section of the army served as an army of occupation. It was the ultimate guarantee of the British hold over the country. Its cost had, however, to be met by the Indian revenues. It was, in fact, a very heavy burden on them. Public services. We have seen above that Indians had little control over the government of India. They were not permitted to play any part in the making of laws or in determining administrative policies. In addition, they were excluded from the bureaucracy which put these policies into practice. All positions of power and responsibility in the administration were occupied by the members of the Indian Civil Service, who were recruited through an annual open competitive examination held in London. Indians also could sit in this examination. Satyendranath Tagore, brother of Rabindranath Tagore, was the first Indian to do so successfully in 1863. Almost every year thereafter, one or two Indians joined the coveted ranks of the civil service, but their number was negligible compared to the English entrants. In practice, the doors of the civil service remained barred to Indians, for they suffered from numerous handicaps. The competitive examination was held in far-away London. It was conducted through the medium of the alien English language. It was based on classical Greek and Latin learning, which could be acquired only after a prolonged and costly course of studies in England. In addition, the maximum age for entry into the civil service was gradually reduced from 23 in 1859 to 19 in 1878. If the young Indian of 23 found it difficult to succeed in the civil service competition, the Indian of 19 found it impossible to do so. In other departments of administration, police, public works department, medicine, posts and telegraphs, forests, engineering, customs, and later railways, the superior and highly paid posts were likewise reserved for British citizens. This preponderance of Europeans in all strategic posts was not accidental. The rulers of India believed it to be an essential condition for the maintenance of British supremacy in India. Thus, Lord Kimberley, the Secretary of State, laid down in 1893 that it is indispensable that an adequate number of the members of the civil service shall always be Europeans. And the Viceroy, Lord Lansdowne, stressed the absolute necessity of keeping the government of this widespread empire in European hands, if that empire is to be maintained. Under Indian pressure, the different administrative services were gradually Indianized after 1918. But the positions of control and authority were still kept in British hands. Moreover, the people soon discovered that Indianization of these services had not put any part of political power in their hands. The Indians in these services functioned as agents of British rule and loyally served Britain's imperial purposes. Relations with the princely states. The Revolt of 1857 led the British to reverse their policy towards the Indian states. Before 1857, they had availed themselves of every opportunity to annex princely states. This policy was now abandoned. Most of the Indian princes had not only remained loyal to the British, but had actively aided the latter in suppressing the revolt. As Lord Canning, the Viceroy, put it, they had acted as breakwaters in the storm. Their loyalty was now rewarded with the announcement that their right to adopt heirs would be respected, and the integrity of their territories guaranteed against future annexation. Moreover, the experience of the revolt had convinced the British authorities that the princely states could serve as useful allies and supporters in case of popular opposition or revolt. Canning wrote in 1860, It was long ago said by Sir John Malcolm that if we made all India into zillas, districts, it was not in the nature of things that our empire should last 50 years, but that if we could keep up a number of native states without political power, but as royal instruments, we should exist in India as long as our naval supremacy was maintained. Of the substantial truth of this opinion, I have no doubt, and the recent events have made it more deserving of our attention than ever. It was therefore decided to use the princely states as firm props of British rule in India. Even the British historian P.E. Roberts has recognized, to preserve them as a bulwark of the empire has ever since been a principle of British policy. Their perpetuation was, however, only one aspect of the British policy towards the princely states. The other was their complete subordination to the British authorities. While even before the revolt of 1857, the British had in practice interfered in the internal affairs of these states, in theory, they had been considered as subsidiary but sovereign powers. This position was now entirely changed. As the price of their continued existence, the princes were made to acknowledge Britain as the paramount power. Canning declared in 1862 that the Crown of England stood forward, the unquestioned ruler and paramount power in all India. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of the Empress of India to emphasize British sovereignty over the entire Indian subcontinent. Lord Curzon later made it clear that the princes ruled their states merely as agents of the British Crown. The princes accepted this subordinate position and willingly became junior partners in the empire because they were assured of their continued existence as rulers of their states. As the paramount power, the British claimed the right to supervise the internal government of the princely states. They not only interfered in the day-to-day administration through the residents, but insisted on appointing and dismissing ministers and other high officials. Sometimes, the rulers themselves were removed or deprived of their powers. One motive for such interference was provided by the British desire to give these states a modern administration so that their integration with British India would be complete. This integration and the consequent interference were also encouraged by the development of all India railways, postal and telegraph systems, currency, and a common economic life. Another motive for interference was provided by the growth of popular democratic and nationalist movements in many of the states. On the one hand, the British authorities helped the rulers suppress these movements. On the other, they tried to eliminate the most serious of administrative abuses in these states. The changed British policy towards the princely states is illustrated by the cases of Mysore and Baroda. Lord Bentinck had deposed the ruler of Mysore in 1831 and taken over the administration of the state. After 1868, the government recognized the adopted heir of the old ruler, and in 1881, the state was fully restored to the young Maharaja. On the other hand, the ruler of Baroda, Malhar Rao Gaikwad, was accused in 1874 of misrule and of trying to poison the British resident and was deposed after a brief trial. Baroda was not, however, annexed. Instead, a young man of the Gaikwad family was put on the throne. Administrative policies. The British attitude towards India and consequently their policies in India changed for the worse after the revolt of 1857. While before 1857 they had tried, however half-heartedly and hesitatingly, to modernize India, they now consciously began to follow reactionary policies. As the historian Percival Spear has put it, the Indian government's honeymoon with progress was over. We have seen above how the organs of administrative control in India and in England, the Indian Army and the Civil Service, were reorganized to exclude Indians from an effective share in administration. Previously, at least lip service had been paid to the idea that the British were preparing the Indians for self-government. The view was now openly put forward that the Indians were unfit to rule themselves and that they must be ruled by Britain for an indefinite period. This reactionary policy was reflected in many fields. Divide and rule. The British had conquered India by taking advantage of the disunity among the Indian powers and by playing them against one another. After 1858, they continued to follow this policy of divide and rule by turning the princes against the people, province against province, caste against caste, group against group, and above all, Hindus against Muslims. The unity displayed by Hindus and Muslims during the revolt of 1857 had disturbed the foreign rulers. They were determined to break this unity so as to weaken the rising nationalist movement. In fact, they missed no opportunity to do so. Immediately after the revolt, they repressed Muslims, confiscated their lands and property on a large scale, and declared Hindus to be their favorites. After 1870, this policy was reversed, and an attempt was made to turn upper class and middle class Muslims against the nationalist movement. The government cleverly used the attractions of government service to create a split along religious lines among the educated Indians. Because of industrial and commercial backwardness and the near absence of social services, the educated Indians depended almost entirely on government service. There were few other openings for them. This led to keen competition among them for the available government posts. The government utilized this competition to fan provincial and communal rivalry and hatred. It promised official favors on a communal basis in return for loyalty, and so played the educated Muslims against the educated Hindus. Hostility to educated Indians. The government of India had actively encouraged modern education after 1833. The universities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras were started in 1857, and higher education spread rapidly thereafter. Many British officials commended the refusal by educated Indians to participate in the revolt of 1857. But this favorable official attitude towards the educated Indians soon changed because some of them had begun to use their recently acquired modern knowledge to analyze the imperialistic character of British rule and to put forward demands for Indian participation in administration. The officials became actively hostile to higher education and to the educated Indians when the latter began to organize a nationalist movement among the people and founded the Indian National Congress in 1885. The officials now took active steps to curtail higher education. They sneered at the educated Indians, whom they commonly referred to as Babus. Thus the British turned against that group of Indians who had imbibed modern Western knowledge and who stood for progress along modern lines. Such progress was, however, opposed to the basic interests and policies of British imperialism in India. The official opposition to the educated Indians and higher education shows that British rule in India had already exhausted whatever potentialities for progress it originally possessed. Attitude towards the zamindars. While being hostile to the forward-looking, educated Indians, the British now turned for friendship to the most reactionary group of Indians, the princes, the zamindars, and the landlords. We have already examined above the changed policy towards the princes and the official attempt to use them as a dam against the rise of popular and nationalist movements. The zamindars and landlords too were placated in the same manner. For example, the lands of most of the talukdars of Awadh were restored to them. The zamindars and landlords were now hailed as the traditional and natural leaders of the Indian people. Their interests and privileges were protected. They were secured in the possession of their land at the cost of the peasants and were utilized as counterweights against the nationalist-minded intelligentsia. The Viceroy, Lord Lytton, openly declared in 1876 that the Crown of England should henceforth be identified with the hopes, the aspirations, the sympathies, and interests of a powerful native aristocracy. The zamindars and landlords, in return, recognized that their position was closely bound up with the maintenance of British rule and became its only firm supporters. Attitude towards social reforms. As a part of the policy of alliance with the conservative classes, the British abandoned their previous policy of helping the social reformers. They believed that their measures of social reform, such as the abolition of the custom of sati and permission to widows to remarry, had been a major cause of the revolt of 1857. They therefore gradually began to side with orthodox opinion and stopped their support to the reformers. Thus, as Jawaharlal Nehru has put it in The Discovery of India, because of this natural alliance of the British power with the reactionaries in India, it became the guardian and upholder of many an evil custom and practice, which it otherwise condemned. In fact, the British were in this respect on the horns of a dilemma. If they favored social reform and passed laws to this effect, the Orthodox Indians opposed them and declared that a government of foreigners had no right to interfere in the internal social affairs of the Indians. On the other hand, if they did not pass such laws, they helped perpetuate social evils and were condemned by socially progressive Indians. It may, however, be noted that the British did not always remain neutral on social questions. By supporting the status quo, they indirectly gave protection to existing social evils. Moreover, by encouraging casteism and communalism for political purposes, they actively encouraged social reaction. Extreme backwardness of social services. While social services like education, sanitation, and public health, water supply, and rural roads made rapid progress in Europe during the 19th century, in India, they remained at an extremely backward level. The government of India spent most of its large income on the army and wars, and the administrative services, and starved the social services. For example, in 1886, of its total net revenue of nearly 47.00 crores, the Government of India spent nearly 19.41 crores on the army and 17 crores on civil administration, but less than 2 crores on education, medicine, and public health, and only 63 lakhs on irrigation. The few halting steps that were taken in the direction of providing services like sanitation, water supply, and public health were usually confined to urban areas and that too to the so-called civil lines or British or modern parts of the cities. They mainly served the Europeans and a handful of upper-class Indians who lived in the European part of the cities. Labor legislation. The condition of workers in modern factories and plantations in the 19th century was miserable. They had to work between 12 and 16 hours a day, and there was no weekly day of rest. Women and children worked the same long hours as men. The wages were extremely low, ranging from 4 rupees to 20 rupees per month. The factories were overcrowded, badly lighted and aired, and completely unhygienic. Work on machines was hazardous and accidents very common. The government of India, which was generally pro-capitalist, took some half-hearted and totally inadequate steps to mitigate the sorry state of affairs in the modern factories, many of which were owned by Indians. In this, it was only in part moved by humanitarian considerations. The manufacturers of Britain put constant pressure on it to pass factory laws. They were afraid that cheap labor would enable Indian manufacturers to outsell them in the Indian market. The first Indian Factory Act was passed in 1881. The act dealt primarily with the problem of child labor. It laid down that children below 7 could not work in factories, while children between 7 and 12 would not work for more than 9 hours a day. Children would also get 4 holidays in a month. The Act also provided for the proper fencing off of dangerous machinery. The Second Indian Factories Act was passed in 1891. It provided for a weekly holiday for all workers. Working hours for women were fixed at 11 per day, while daily hours of work for children were reduced to 7. Hours of work for men were still left unregulated. Neither of the two acts applied to British-owned tea and coffee plantations. On the contrary, the government gave every help to the foreign planters to exploit their workers in a most ruthless manner. Most of the tea plantations were situated in Assam, which was very thinly populated and had an unhealthy climate. Labor to work the plantations had therefore to be brought from outside. The planters would not attract workers from outside by paying high wages. Instead, they used coercion and fraud to recruit them and then keep them as virtual slaves on the plantations. The Government of India gave planters full help and passed penal laws in 1863, 1865, 1870, 1873, and 1882 to enable them to do so. Once a laborer had signed a contract to go and work in a plantation, he could not refuse to do so. Any breach of contract by a laborer was a criminal offense, the planter also having the power to arrest him. Better labor laws were, however, passed in the 20th century under the pressure of the rising trade union movement. Still, the condition of the Indian working class remained extremely depressed and deplorable. Restrictions on the press. The British had introduced the printing press in India and thus initiated the development of the modern press. The educated Indians had immediately recognized that the press could play a great role in educating public opinion and in influencing government policies through criticism and censure. Ram Mohan Roy, Vidyasagar, Dadabhai Nauroji, Justice Ranade, Surendranath Banerjee, Lokmanya Tilak, G. Subramanya Iyer, C. Karmakar Menon, Madan Mohan Malviya, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra and other Indian leaders played an important part in starting newspapers and making them a powerful political force. The press had gradually become a major weapon of the nationalist movement. The Indian press was freed of restrictions by Charles Metcalfe in 1835. This step had been welcomed enthusiastically by the educated Indians. It was one of the reasons why they had for some time supported British rule in India. But the nationalists gradually began to use the press to arouse national consciousness among the people and to sharply criticize the reactionary policies of the government. This turned the officials against the Indian press, and they decided to curb its freedom. This was attempted by passing the Vernacular Press Act in 1878. This act put serious restrictions on the freedom of the Indian language newspapers. Indian public opinion was now fully aroused, and it protested loudly against the passage of this act. This protest had immediate effect, and the act was repealed in 1881. For nearly 25 years thereafter, the Indian press enjoyed considerable freedom. But the rise of the militant Swadeshi and boycott movement after 1905 once again led to the enactment of repressive press laws in 1908 and 1910. Racial antagonism. The British in India had always held aloof from the Indians and felt themselves to be racially superior. The revolt of 1857 and the atrocities committed by both sides had further widened the gulf between the Indians and the British, who now began to openly assert the doctrine of racial supremacy and practice racial arrogance. Railway compartments, waiting rooms at railway stations, parks, hotels, swimming pools, clubs, etc., reserved for Europeans only, were visible manifestations of this racialism. The Indians felt humiliated. In the words of Jawaharlal Nehru, "We in India have known racialism in all its forms ever since the commencement of British rule." The whole ideology of this rule was that of Herrenvolk and the master race, and the structure of government was based upon it. Indeed, the idea of a master race is inherent in imperialism. There was no subterfuge about it. It was proclaimed in unambiguous language by those in authority. More powerful than words was the practice that accompanied them. And generation after generation, and year after year, India as a nation and Indians as individuals was subjected to insult, humiliation, and contemptuous treatment. The English were an imperial race, we were told, with the God-given right to govern us and keep us in subjection. If we protested, we were reminded of the tiger qualities of an imperial race. Exercises. 1. Discuss the important changes made in the administration of India after 1858, especially in the fields of constitutional change, provincial administration, local bodies, the army, and the public services. 2. What changes did British attitude undergo towards Indian unity, the educated Indians, the zamindars and princes, and social reforms after the revolt of 1857? 3. Write short notes on the Imperial Legislative Council after 1861, B. Backwardness of social services, C. Factory labor legislation of 1881 and 1891, D. Plantation labor, E. Freedom of the press. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the History of Modern India by Bipin Chandra. Thank you for listening. Let's meet in the next episode.